What would you think if you saw a woman driving recklessly down the middle of the highway, the wrong way, and then she crashed her car with her 2-year-old daughter in the back seat, right into Walmart? What if I told you that she was suffering from a schizophrenic episode and she had no recollection of the accident at all? What if I told you that she was completely sober and had been sober from all drugs and alcohol for over 2 years? And what if she had been treated by mental health agents for over a year? Would you still incriminate her, causing her to lose her daughter and go to jail where she would not be treated for her mental illness? This is what I'm going to be speaking about with you today: inmates and mental illnesses. We, the United States, often criminalize the mentally ill and use jails and prisons instead of sending the person to a mental institution to receive help and to rehabilitate the person. Unfortunately, the goal of jails is not to rehabilitate, like the juvenile system, but to just stop the crime and protect others in society. There are now 3 times more people with mental illnesses incarcerated in the United States than there are in mental institutions. Psychiatric patients often run into the law while being treated. For example, researchers reported that 12% of adult psychiatric patients receiving treatment in the San Diego County Health System have been incarcerated, and 28 of Connecticut residents being treated for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder have been arrested or detained. So, looking at all the statistics, we can try to explain the rise in mental illnesses in prisons and jails. Public health officials and researchers point to the closure of state psychiatric hospitals in the late 1960s. These closures were intended to allow patients to return back to their families and live independently. Sadly, these intentions were not met, and many people who were released from the institutions found themselves arrested, often for minor offenses. For many inmates, their path to incarceration started at a young age. Many had rough childhoods that were filled with trauma, abuse, and poverty. These kids were often known as the difficult ones, growing up in their homes and their schools. Often their families didn't have the right resources, time, or money to treat them, and they often ended up getting worse until they could no longer help their actions. Many of these inmates grew up with parents or caregivers who were in and out of jail. They often witnessed violence and sexual abuse, and this victimization leads to or intensifies mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and PTSD. As these kids grow up, their conditions get worse, and they often turn to drugs and alcohol to soothe their anxiety or numb their pain. This coping method is expensive, so they usually have to commit property crimes and/or prostitution to pay for their drugs and alcohol. This activity usually escalates to violent offenses or lands them in jail. Jail and prisons are particularly bad places to be mentally ill in. People with mental health issues are put into stressful environments, like seclusion, for long periods of time. For example, inmates that suffer from mental health illnesses are 2 times more likely to be in a fight with other inmates and 3 times more likely to be injured compared to inmates without mental health illnesses. Many inmates that are struggling with mental issues are sentenced to time in solitary confinement. This is used as the roughest disciplinary tool for the worst of the worst. It is used to reprogram the brain to learn that you are not in control anymore. Research shows that 25 to 40% of these inmates suffer from some sort of mental illness. These inmates are alone for years and barely have any human contact at all. They experience immense amount of loneliness, and the brain processes the feeling of loneliness the same place as physical pain. Researchers also have said that many of the inmates were psychologically mad during their time in solitary confinement. This graph shows the most common types of mental issues among inmates. This number becomes even more alarming when we learn that 55% of total male inmates are struggling with a mental illness, while a staggering 73% of total females are also struggling. Another alarming factor about these numbers is that only 1 in 3 state prisoners and 1 in 6 jail prisoners have received mental health treatment since they have been incarcerated. After their time in jail, inmates are released back to the environment where they came from, and many of them return back to the lives filled with poverty and trauma. Many inmates' goals are to get a job and to keep their families together, but these challenges are even harder when they are suffering from a mental illness. This is a vicious cycle that never ends for these people. They grow up with the illness that they cannot cope with, causing them to get into trouble and sending them to jail. During their time in jail, they don't get the help that they need, so their condition gets worse, and by the time they are getting out of jail, they are struggling with their illness so much that they cannot be productive members of society, and they find themselves in even more trouble and land in jail again. This is a problem that we need to fix. There needs to be more rehabilitation in our correctional system.